Hello and welcome to today's webinar. The future of work is now: how to launch your remote workforce with EUC. This event is part of the EUC Masterclass series. So look for upcoming invitations to the EUC Masterclass series. There are two more upcoming events after this on this topic, including work from home alone, keeping the bad guys out and managing chaos, and freedom of choice. Application catalogs empower users to self-service. So a couple good events coming up in the series on this topic. Keep an eye out for email invitations. All right, we are about to kick off today's event. Before we jump into it, I first want to remind everyone about a few housekeeping topics that you should be aware of. So let's see, my name is David Davis of ActualTech Media, and I'll serve as the moderator on today's webinar. This event is brought to you in partnership with Nutanix. Thank you to Nutanix for making this event possible. And we want this to be an educational event. So it's entitled EUC Masterclass Series. And so this is a great forum to get all your questions answered about end user computing and about VDI. More and more companies are 100% work from home these days. And it's a challenge, for many IT organizations out there. A lot of IT organizations weren't really planning on a workforce that is 100% work from home. And so many remote connections, remote security, all of these challenges that we're suddenly being faced with. So this is a great way to get your questions answered and help us and help you solve your challenges related to your remote workforce. So make sure you use that questions box on the left-hand side of your audience console. We'll be doing dedicated Q&A after today's presentation, also answering electronic questions throughout. We also have a Tango $300 gift card that we'll be announcing at the end of today's webinar. If you aren't familiar with Tango gift cards, they can be redeemed for electronic gift cards at your choice of hundreds of retailers, including Walmart, Best Buy, many restaurants. So it's kind of a universal gift card. You're not having to use it at just a single company or a single store. You can exchange it for many other types of gift cards. The requirements to be eligible for the prize drawing are that you must be present on the live event. And the full prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab if you are interested in reading the legalese around the prize drawing. If you're watching this event on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. And with that, I'm excited to introduce you to today's expert presenter on this first EUC Masterclass event. That is Mr. Brian Suhr, Principal Technical Marketing Engineer at Nutanix. I've known Brian for many years. He's a VCDX. He has some incredible technical certifications, and it's really exciting to have him on today's event. So with that, I'll hand it over to Brian. Take it away.
Hello and welcome to the EUC Masterclass series presented by Nutanix. This is part one, called Giant Steps and Baby Steps. But really what we're talking about is, if you're looking at doing end user computing, what are some of the steps that you're going to need to take? What's it going to look like when designing a solution for your users? My name is Brian Suhr. I'm a Principal Tech Marketing Engineer here at Nutanix. Some background on it: a lot of the material that we're going to talk about today in this session is contained in a book that I've written previously. So there was an original version called Architecting EUC Solutions. It's available on Amazon, and we recently updated that. Just came out here shortly a few weeks ago with some of my cohorts here at Nutanix, and there'll be a version available, a digital version, and a copy you can get from your field teams from Nutanix. And this has the bulk of the information we're talking about today, but in greater detail, as well as many more topics around around this topic. So let's get started. There's a ton of questions to ask first that you need answers to when you're looking at deploying end user computing, but certainly when you're in the design and architecture type phases, right? Typically you'll get, if you're in engineering or in architecture, or maybe you're an IT leader, there's going to be a request. Typically a request comes in. Hey, we need to do virtual desktops. I need to let people work remotely. But this type of request comes in all types, sizes, and flavors. Some will be simple and some will be more complex. And the more the complex is necessarily a bad thing, right? Because something simple could just be more confusing, right? The simple side, it could be, hey, I need to allow a small group of people the ability to access an application remotely, as an example, right? Pretty clear and concise, but just simple, sounds like it has a small scope. To something more complex, need to provide everyone in an organization the ability to work remotely. There's a bunch of different use cases, probably very different complex requirements for all of them, and we have a globally distributed workforce, right? So there's just a lot of stuff to unpack in there, and not necessarily a bad thing, just what questions do you got to ask so that you can get the proper answers so that you can do this. And then, what kind of project, timeline are you going to have, because that'll maybe adjust, some of the architecture decisions you have and maybe how fast you need to move for it. So is it a normal project timeline, or is it like a hair on fire kind of timeline? Hair on fire timeline would be, 2020, we have a pandemic, and that forced a lot of people to work from home. So it was a lot of hair on fire projects. But a normal example would be, maybe work for an organization and they buy another company and it's an acquisition. And typically it's pretty common in those scenarios where as companies, buy another company and they need to give the new company access to systems and applications, that a virtual, access method to share some applications is pretty common in those types of situations. And then, what types of users are in scope for this? Is it every user, or is it just the accounting users, or, call centers, etc., right? So who's all in scope, and how many users in each of those use cases are in scope, and how many total users? So is it all of accounting, or is it just 10 people in accounting? Is it every single call center person, every single, nurse in a hospital organization? So getting, those fine details of who's going to be counts, because that all plays into the design and architecture that we'll be going through. So I think early on you ask yourself, what services do you need to provide? So there are a number of services that could fall under the end user computing or workspaces umbrella. We're really just going to focus on two here for these webinar series, and that's really virtual desktops or application presentation. And the real question is, which one do you need? Or maybe you need both, because it is actually pretty common if you have a lot of use cases, that some use cases may use one and some use cases use the other, and rarely you'll find a use case that may have needs to use them both. So really the difference between the two is virtual desktops is you're really giving a full desktop experience to your end users. So they're going to get a login screen. They're going to log into Windows typically, right? There's some Linux, but it's vastly Windows for this. And then they're going to log in and they'll have all their applications and data in that desktop experience. So it feels like a normal PC experience. So rather than logging onto a laptop or a desktop, there's a login into a virtual instance that's hosted somewhere. Now, a downside of that is it's more resource intensive, right? So if you're hosting all these individual desktop sessions, you're going to use a lot more storage capacity, because every person is getting their own copy of the applications. They're getting a full Windows install, and just consumes more space. Now you can do VDI in a couple different ways. There's the one-to-one relationship where basically it's one VM to one user. So each user has their full VM with the full OS applications, and typically their user data stored in that. So that's the one-to-one relationship. But you can do a many-to-one relationship, and that's more of the RDSH or shared hosted desktop, where you would typically create a VM running a Windows Server OS, and then you would allow multiple desktop sessions in there. So in that case, you'd have a handful of users, and the number of users per VM would vary greatly based upon the applications and what the users are doing in there. So it could be as low as a handful of users in there and as high as maybe 20 so users per VM. So it's a different ratio, but it can be a similar experience for the end users, but different obviously on the operational sides, because now you're managing less VMs with a bunch of users sharing things in there. But that can cause challenges on the applications, because some applications don't like to be installed that way and don't like to be shared between different users, and obviously there's a different security dynamic in there. So I like to say you don't rule either of these out, because as you kind of break down the use cases, which we'll dive into later, is some use cases fit great in VDI, and then some can maybe use the RDSH desktop hosting, and then others would be in the application presentation, which we're going to talk about next. So application presentation is exactly that, just what it sounds like. So rather than presenting a whole desktop to somebody, you're just presenting them maybe one application or maybe a couple applications. So when they log into their browser, they log into their VDI client, whatever, they're going to see applications rather than like a desktop choice. So when they click those icons, it's going to launch the application, and it just looks like they're running an application typically, right? So this is also commonly known as RDSH. It's Windows based, and you're just sharing an application that's installed typically on a server OS in the background. So this is typically less resource intensive because it's the many-to-one relationship. So on the storage space, certainly less resource intensive, because you're not having multiple copy. Everybody's not getting their own copy of the app, their own copy of the OS. So in that sense, it's less resource intensive. On the CPU memory side of it, since there is some sharing, there's less Windows instances. You may or may not, see much of a difference there. It all depends on your applications and such for that. Now to continue on the use cases, right? So what is a use case? Simply, a use case is just a group of users with similar requirements. The group of users may or may not be in the same job within your organization, right? So you could think of accounting as a use case. Healthcare workers as a use case, like doctors versus nurses. Call center, an engineering use case, right? So certainly those are all natural use cases, but even within accounting, as an example, there could be different use cases because the users have different applications as part of that. So you can't just go so simple as, okay, accounting's one, call center's another, etc., right? So you really have to look at the requirements, because the requirements drive it. You may have an accounting user and an engineering users that have the exact same requirements. The only difference is the applications that they use. And depending on how you manage and present your applications, you may be able to offer that flexibility while still delivering within the same requirements base. So it all is going to depend on how you manage your apps. So identifying the requirements, right? This is just like a small, taste of what you would be looking at for the requirements for each of these use cases, but it gets your thought process thinking and head you in the right direction. So first off, right, we just talked about, desktops versus applications, right? So for each use case, you need to look at, do I need to present them with a desktop, or simply can I, present them an application or applications? And if I'm giving them a desktop, do they need a persistent desktop, or can they fit in a non-persistent desktop? And we're going to talk a bit more about that later also. And then what applications do each use case use, or will they use? The reason why you care about applications is there's certainly licensing implications. For example, let's say Office. If everybody in your organization doesn't use Office, you don't want to present it to everybody, because now you have to pay for them. And certainly more expensive applications like engineering apps or accounting apps that are used really by a subset of users. You just want to be able to assign those to the users that are actually need them and are going to use them, so you're not paying additional licensing costs. And then certainly on the infrastructure resources. So All applications use different amount of resources, right? They use different CPU, memory. Some have graphical needs that they may need a GPU, right? So understanding who's going to use which applications, what resources is going to play into the sizing that we'll talk about later for that also. And also, if they just need a browser, it's going to be much simpler to standardize on one browser, so you're not having to present 3 or 4 different browsers within your organization and then deal with managing all those. So you're going to need to discover that list of applications, and you can do that in a number of different ways. You can, take surveys, you can interview the different people within the use cases, you can use an application, but the real key here is you need to build a list of applications, and then you'll need to match those applications to the different use cases. In there, you'll probably discover you may or may not have multiple versions for the same application. Do they need multiple versions? Can they just standardize on one of them? How are you going to deal with one-offs, right? So today, if you're in the physical world where everybody has laptops and desktops, you may or may not allow them to install applications. So they may not use the approved IT version for some job function. They may have gone off and got something like Evernote or some application, and it's one-off. Maybe they bought it themselves. Maybe it's free. Is it going to be approved, or are we going to force them to use whatever the organizational standard for that? And then the discovery part, right? So certainly interviewing people is a slow and tedious process. Usually you'd want some kind of automated discovery, and there are tools that you could do that. You can pay consulting people to come and do application rationalization projects, which are expensive and lengthy. So typically some type of tool that could discover as part of that, and we'll talk a bit about more when we talk about some sizing. You're going to need to know what kind of peripherals they use. Do they need like web cameras? Do they have like microphones for recording? Maybe they're a transcriptionist and they have foot pedals or signature pads like in healthcare, etc. Right? So there's a whole world of different peripherals out there. They connect to PCs in different ways. So you're going to want to understand what's required. Are you going to be able to pass that into your virtual session and be able to make it work properly? Do they have any security restrictions that you need to account for? Like, do I need to restrict application access for certain use cases? Network access, right? Do they just get the same kind of access that a PC plugging into your network would be, or since they're possibly coming from external, or they may not even be employees, they may be contractors, do I need to restrict them to a subset of things? And are they heavy video users? Do they do a lot of conferencing? Do they watch training videos? Those types of different things. And what are they doing, this full screen at HD quality, or is it just a windowed version at more of a lower definition? So understanding these requirements and how often they do them will play into your sizing and design decisions also. How are they going to access things? Believe you that this will matter actually. So what types of endpoints are they using? Because there are differences in endpoints, right? So somebody that uses a Chromebook or some type of thin PC that maybe has some Windows embedded, or it has a 0OS, is much different than somebody using a laptop, like an actual laptop with Mac OS or Windows on it or Linux, etc. Right? Because the more powerful endpoints can actually offload some of that computing for a much better experience. So depending upon what the requirements are, that may drive what type of endpoint they need also. And then also there's specialized endpoints like thin clients that look like laptops, or there's blast proof ones that go on manufacturing floors, etc. So dealing with those. And then do they want to use like a client, so like the Citrix client, or that type of client to access it, or do they want their experience to come through a web browser? Because maybe they don't have company provided assets, they're just going to use their personal phone, tablet, or PC. So it's maybe easier to just access their desktop or application through a web browser. There is some difference for all the manufacturers between what's available in the actual client versus a web browser, because web browser is more restricting for like USB access and passing things through, and multiple monitors and different things like that. So understanding those capabilities and then matching them to the requirements will be a choice there. And then, do these users, are they going to access their sessions locally? Like, are they in a corporate office on a LAN accessing them, or are they going to be remote workers, working from home, or maybe they're contractors, working from a different part of the world? And some people will do both. Like, they may in the day work in the office, and other times they'll work remotely. And then, why does this all matter for infrastructure sizing? So it matters because you need to identify how much resources are going to be required. Focusing on the VDI side, you need to understand, how much CPU memory, I/O, and how much capacity. Do they have different OS requirements? So luckily today we're just really focused on one Windows version, which is Windows 10. I'm sure there are plenty of organizations out there that have older pockets of Windows versions, but we really are blessed to just have one Windows version at the time. But even just last year, there was still a good discussion about Windows 7 versus Windows 10. And there's application issues there. There's the different amounts of resources that they use. You want to know the applications, like mentioned previous in the slide, which applications they're using, how often they use them, how much resources they're doing, whether they're going to be persistent or non-persistent, and do they need graphics, is a GPU required? Because that's all going to play into any sizing. And if it's heavily focused on the on-prem side, right? So if you're hosting these on clusters in your data center, then you need to be able to size, how much compute, memory, and storage you're going to need for that. But if you're going to run your apps and desktops in the cloud, then you're going to need to be able to select the instance size, right? So you still need to know this information. It's just sized differently, right? You're typically, going to pick a cloud instance, and that's going to be the size. So that instance needs to have enough memory, enough storage capacity, and enough compute. That compute is going to be a value that's guaranteed to you, so it's going to be a little bit different sizing, but still similar enough. And collecting and managing all the data, right? So you should come up with something, whether it's a spreadsheet. I like to use tables like this, so you can use a spreadsheet or a database or whatever place. But I think you need to have something where you can put in your identified use cases. You can list all the attributes, which is basically your list of questions that you need to discover from everybody, and then you need to populate the data in there, right? So I've included a simple sample with this. It's one from the book. And then this is just a way that you can track all the answers, be able to refer back to this when you're making decisions. And then also you can look for those similarities, right? So potential where, what looks like different use cases could actually be a single use case, because again, maybe the only difference is the endpoint that they're accessing from or the applications that they're using, and then those are really not a limiting factor in how that you deliver them. And what I mean by basically finding commonalities in the use cases is if you're doing straight VDI, like persistent VDI, where you install the applications in there, then potentially you need an image for each one of these. But if you can deliver the apps a different way, or at least part of the apps a different way, then you can cut down on the number of images that you need as a sample. So to talk more about sizing for VDI, some rules and guidelines. So you're going to need to collect data. And if you're coming from a physical world and then moving into the virtual world, that means you're going to need to collect the data from the physical laptops and PCs that your users are running on today. You can do this a number of different ways. There are specialized tools from Liquidware and Lakeside. They both offer assessment tools that you can install agents on these physical PCs and then collect the data. If you don't want to do that type of process, then you could use Perfmon or some other performance reporting tool. Now, the benefit of using the actual collection tool is once you install the agent, then you're typically able to create groups of users, like collections, that could match up to your use cases if you know them at that time. And then they're going to collect a wealth of performance data, They're going to offer some sizing recommendations for you, and they're also going to typically give you a list of the applications that are installed on each of these users. So that's going to save you a lot of legwork in there. If you already have virtualized users, and maybe you're doing some kind of a scaling project, or you're bringing on new use cases, etc., but if they're already virtualized, you can use the same tools, or you could use like the performance tools that are available, something like VROPS from VMware if you're running on ESXi, where you can look at the CPU memory consumption, IO consumption. It's not an automated, right? You're going to have to go in and pull a bunch of charts and then store that data somewhere into a table and do it. So really fall back to the assessment tools are much better. And then how long of a sample period are you going to need? So typically I like to say bare minimum you need at least a week. Ideally you'd like 2 weeks to a month. If you go to a month, then basically you've done a whole cycle of the work, so that if some use cases like every month, like accounting has a big closing operation and their resources are much different than the other weeks. That way you figure out the outliers and you make sure you account for all this in your sampling period. But certainly a point in time, if you just log into a session, look at what somebody's consuming at that point, is really the worst possible way that you could collect data, because at that point of time they could be basically doing nothing, so you'd be really low, or they could be doing some complex operation that they do 5 minutes out of the week, and then now you're going to size with way too many resources, because that would be kind of balanced out in your overall planning. So what type of data points do you want to collect, right? So you need to understand the memory, how much is allocated to them versus how much they use. Memory is pretty simple. CPU, you need to look at the peak that they use and the average, because you really need to understand the peak, how often they hit that, so that that can be accounted for when you size in the cluster. Do they have any graphics requirements? Do you know if you need GPUs or not? How much capacity they need for disk? Windows and Office versions, and then the application list. So that all comes in there again. And then why it can affect your sizings, right? So again, we're probably not sizing for Windows 7 anymore, but just to give you an idea, because whatever the next version of Windows come out will affect us. So there was actually a fairly substantial difference in the amount of CPU required between Windows 7 and Windows 10. And then even Office versions, right? So these differences can be anywhere from 10 to 25, 30%. And then if you upgrade your Windows version and your Office version at the same time, that can actually be a huge impact. It could be upwards of 30, 40%. So that means you're getting 30 or 40% less users on the same hardware as that. And then when Spectrum Meltdown came out and the other security patches, and this is just a fact of life, they'll probably continue to come out, is those patches, when you remediate them, they typically have an impact on performance and the amount of resources that they use. So it just means you get a few less users on each server that you're doing them. And then memory configs and memory speed, right? So depending on the DIMM slots that you populate, it can drop your memory speed down. So you may be getting more memory in the box, but you're getting a slower memory speed, which affects your performance. And then the display protocol, right? So a lot of the vendors have different display protocols. You may get better performance on one, but it uses more CPU on the back end as an example. So understand which display protocol you're going to use and what that's going to do, to your sizing. Persistent versus non-persistent, what's the difference, and do you even care, right? So persistent is like traditional PCs. So they're a bunch of snowflakes. They're all individually unique. So each VM gets its full copy of the OS, and it's got the apps installed in there, so they're consuming all that space. You're going to have to upgrade each of those independently. The benefit is it's easier to design and deploy, and since it's what you've been doing in the physical world, the operation side of that's obviously pretty well understood, right? You can typically use all your same tool set. If you patch them with System Center, you can continue to do that. It does use more storage capacity, obviously, because you're storing much more data. The non-persistent side of it, basically the VMs are disposable. They all read from a single gold image, or at least a single gold image for a pool of desktops. The changes of the VMs are typically flushed upon logout, the VM is destroyed and recreated and it's all back to pristine state. That does not mean that the user data cannot be kept, right? So the user experience can still feel persistent to the user. They can make their changes to the background, add things to a dictionary in Word, etc. Whatever changes they have, they can persist along with their data. But the background operational functions, they change, because now rather than managing a bunch of snowflakes, you're now managing a few gold images that you're going to patch and feed and care for, and it cuts down on your patching operations. But you will have to learn new tools, right? So you're going to build your images different, you're going to patch them different, you're typically going to have to get a profile management tool to capture and manage that profile, so you're going to have to learn that and maybe some other tools for that. They do use less storage space because now you're not keeping full copies of hundreds or thousands of copies of Windows. But both types do use the same amount of CPU and memory, right? So if I run the same users in persistent and non-persistent, you're not going to see some drastic amount of CPU and memory that they're going to consume, right? It should be the same. Real difference is how you operationally do things, and then the amount of storage capacity that's being used. And then what does a migration look like? So migrating users on the persistent side, since it's similar to PC deployments like we spoke about, can I just do P2V conversions and convert them from physical to virtual for each user? The answer is no. That'd be a pretty bad idea, because those PCs out there probably are really bloated. They got a bunch of monitoring stuff for the different type of PC and things like that. That's just going to bloat and use storage space and consume a lot of CPU cycles. That would be wasting your server resources. So you still want to build an efficient VDI image that's lean. It's doesn't use a lot of space. It's only got exactly what's in there, and it should be optimized, right? You're turning things on and off that make it work better in a virtualized environment. And then you're really just migrating user profiles, right? So if you can start with new profiles, hey, that's really easy. But if they want to keep their user profiles and obviously they have data, then you would use some kind of profile migration tool. There's a bunch of them out there that you can accomplish this. But basically, you typically install some type of agent, probably on their existing physical PC, use that to capture it, and then centrally store it, and then it can be accessed by the virtualized version. Non-persistent, similar, right? You're going to build that efficient VDI image, lean optimized, adjust for any challenges. Since it is a non-persistent VM, and then you're capturing the profile, some kind of profile tool, you may, depending on how the profile tool uses, some just paint with a broad brush and capture everything, and others are more selective, where you just capture the minimal amounts. So there may be applications that you install that you have to go and tell it to capture certain registry keys or a certain folder that contains data, or not. And you may even have a couple of use cases where you don't need to capture their profiles at all, right? So if they're out on the manufacturing floor, right, they're not creating any files, they're not storing any data typically. Same thing with maybe healthcare workers, like frontline nurses. They're really just accessing the apps or the desktop, and then pulling up the healthcare software and looking at the data in there, right? They're not creating Word documents and playing movie files and etc. like that. So in those use cases, they probably have no profile data to capture. So you could just simply do non-persistent, present them with the apps, and then you're off, and it's nice and clean. But for others, you'll capture and their profile data from their physicals if needed, and then make them available in the virtual world. So we've kind of been talking about things in a general term, but really there's kind of two sides of the EUC. There's call it the on-prem world for apps and desktops, and we like to call that just end user computing, more commonly referred to as VDI. And then there's the desktop as a service, right? A cloud service where you're just subscribing to something, and typically the control plane at minimum is hosted in the cloud, and then your desktops and apps may or may not be in the cloud or on-prem. And that kind of breaks down for Nutanix customers in a couple ways, right? So for the EUC or the VDI world, it's really Citrix and VMware Horizon heavily. On the left, right, these are typically installed on-prem on infrastructure, and then how this looks. To get these deployed, you build a bunch of Windows VMs and you install the EUC infrastructure pieces in there, right? So for Horizon and for Citrix, there's a bunch of different types of servers that you deploy, and you typically need multiple copies of them so you have high availability. And then you also scale those for the number of users that you're going to be doing. If it's a multi-site design, you'll have to repeat this in each site, right? So if you want to host users and you need infrastructure there, you'll have to build an instance of this in each of your data centers for them. This is pretty much the most common way that you do things on-prem. You'll need to learn how to scale this infrastructure. You're obviously responsible for the upgrades of it, unless you hire somebody to do the upgrades. Whereas desktop as a service, Nutanix iFrame, similar capabilities, very much the same experience for the end user, but it's a service that you subscribe to, right? So the control plane is in the cloud. It's all managed by Nutanix, so you're really just focused on managing that desktop OS and the applications, and all the brokering layer is taken care of as a service, right? So there's no need to think about scaling. It's just a service, and then it's easy to deploy in multiple zones or regions. So it's a single control plane for iFrame. And then you can simply pick your cloud vendor, or whether you want on-prem and you have infrastructure. So you can use Nutanix clusters with HV running on them, and you can enable those as resource zones for Frame to provision against on-prem. So these are just zones that you can pick. So if you want to have some users running on the West Coast in Amazon and some on the East Coast in Azure, and then maybe some in one or two of your data centers, you can do that, right? So much simpler process. You're not worrying about those upgrades. It's easy to scale, just a different way to consume EUC services. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Hopefully it was educational. And remember, this is a 3-part series, so remember to come back and tune in for parts 2 and 3 with us. Thanks.